Thank you, Ed. I have to tell you, this is a real thrill for me to be here. When Sally faxed me the proofs for the brochure, and I noticed my name next to David Hicks and Fishing Cops and even my friend Robert Littlejohn, Bob Shibley, I thought for sure they'd made a mistake. But I'm happy to be invited, and I'm happy to serve you in whatever way I can. As a matter of fact, yes, I grew up in a tradition of Christianity that I frequently call now ugly church, and not only do I believe that the Christian church needs, especially the Christian church in America, needs to work hard at understanding truth, work hard at a clear understanding of virtue and goodness, but we need to work hard at developing an aesthetic understanding as well that is pleasing to God and reflects the principles found in His Word. And I am more and more impressed with that effort in the Lutheran Church, and so I commend you all in whatever ways you do it for continuing that tradition of an aesthetically pleasing service to God. The title of my talk this afternoon is Teaching for Eloquence, the application of rhetoric to a modern pedagogy. I want to ask the question, though, does our end justify our means? Does our end justify our means? And we're going to take a look at rhetoric as a justification of the means of classical schooling through the trivium. Now, in her classic speech at Oxford, Dorothy L. Sayers, made the claim that as modern educators jettison the medieval trivium from the conventional curriculum, they replace their ability to teach students how to think with the tyranny of always having to tell students what to think. I suggest, along with a host of others, many of whom we've heard already this week, Bob Shibley and David Hicks and others, that not only has modern education lost the ability to teach students how to think, but we have lost the ability to teach students what to think about. It is admirable to teach students a dependable dialectic, a way of consistent thinking. But if the student's mind is not occupied with admirable thoughts, then we've taught him to contemplate trivia. He'll make a great game show contestant, but he'll have nothing to show for his cleverness at the end of the day except cash prizes and a few minutes of fame. We have little idea what St. Paul meant when he prescribed truth, honesty, justice, purity, and loveliness as the common topics of fruitful thinking. Socrates claimed that if a person could be taught noble things, then he would act nobly. To know the good is to do it. The problem with this notion, as we all know, is that it contradicts orthodox theology, as well as the experience of every person sitting in this room. Every day we rise, as we did this morning, with a prayer on our lips. Lord, help us to love others as we love ourselves. Help us to love you with all that we have. And still, despite the truth of our intention, we find ourselves lacking. Every day we come face to face with the reality of our inability to live up to the expectations of the law and our need for the saving grace of the gospel. St. Augustine inserted a critical element into this Platonic illusion. He inserted the notion of the will. The good man, the noble man, is the one who knows what is right, knows what is good, and possesses the strength of will by God's sovereign grace to do what he knows. There is nothing automatic. Nobility requires both the knowledge and the exercise of one's will in pursuit of goodness. And we all know that. We all see that in our own lives. But more than just self-centered understanding and willfulness, we also know that the truly good person is one who pursues the well-being of others. St. Paul admonished his followers to look after the interests of others before looking to their own concerns. In our education, ought to prepare students for this three-part mission: to know what is good, to be able to do good, and to pursue the good of others. Now let me jump back to Sayers briefly. Her advice is commendable, but it is strictly academic. It contains no hint of the educated person who transcends the concerns of her own carefully ordered life, impact the lives of those around her. We do need to teach students how to think, but we also must prescribe an end for that thinking, which reflects the larger task of education. Our goals for our students must be more ennobling in their mastery of the clever expression of ideas. We must have an end in mind which justifies our means. Now at this point, I don't know, you might expect me to abandon Dorothy Sayers altogether, but I want to address our attention for the next few minutes back to the scantily addressed third element of the medieval trivium, rhetoric. In most recent discussions on the trivium, rhetoric has gotten short shrift, as it has, as Robert pointed out earlier, in Sayers' treatment. This is partly caused, I think, by the modernistic view of the trivium as a developmental paradigm rather than the integrative set of pedagogical principles that Robert also proposed earlier. It's also caused by an insufficient definition of classical rhetoric and the classically trained orator. Now, we've all noticed that our culture is plagued with sloppy thinking. You may also have noticed that many people are unimpressed with clear and ordered thinking when they encounter it. Logical arguments don't hold much authority. They certainly don't hold the authority that they once did. When I was younger, I spent some time on college campuses evangelizing students. There I was, armed with the classical proofs for the existence of God. I had all sorts of evidence piled up for the uniqueness of Christ, even in a pluralistic society. And I attacked mentally sluggish co-eds with all the dialectical fury I could muster. And they withered in front of me. The surprising result of these conversations, though, left me completely flummoxed. After deftly articulating Descartes' teleological argument for God's conscious design of the universe, I was repeatedly met with the decisive and compelling, so, that was hard to take. I put a lot of effort into this conversation, and it was over. The word that they concluded it with didn't even have 2 syllables. And I had just said teleological. In recent years, there's been some progress in this respect, because the elegant rebuttal that succeeds these conversations now, or follows these conversations now, is the ubiquitous whatever. You heard it coming, didn't you? The goal of our education program is simply to render students compellingly clever. Then I'm afraid we are abandoning them weaponless in a postmodern and a post-Christian world. And at the same time, we abandon our postmodern culture to its own cyclical and self-destructive patterns of thinking and behaving. Our students need the trivium because it does order their minds and it focuses the task of learning. Our culture, however, needs our students who are educated so that they will lead the culture toward an ennobling sensibility that affirms life, affirms liberty, and affirms the dignity of every person created in God's image. In the 1st century A.D., the Roman educator Quintilian unquestioningly proposed the education of the orator, who he called the good man speaking well. His education would be comprised of the liberal arts, grammatical instruction, philosophical and ethical training, courses in the sciences, literature, and the arts. But over the orator's entire education stood the discipline of rhetoric. It was the means by which this well-educated, virtuous student would impact his society for good His chief role would be to strengthen the morals and philosophical seriousness of his fellow citizens, leading them toward advantageous policies which reflected traditional societal values. And should he abandon this role, and should the orator use his superior training for his own selfish advantage, or to undermine the moral convictions of society, then, according to Quintilian, he forfeited the honorable title of orator. He ceased to be a rhetorician in the proper sense. 350 years later, Christianity had eclipsed Roman paganism as the chief religion of the empire. St. Augustine built on Quintilian's prescription for the ideal orator, however, by describing the notable characteristics of wisdom and eloquence, the two things that would characterize those who could lead the culture toward ennobling goals. James Davison Hunter, who recently, he coined the term culture wars in his book, not recently anymore, several years ago. He did, though, recently define wisdom as spiritually animated intelligence. You take all the things that someone knows and you wrap them together with historic Christian faith, and what you get is a new kind of reason, a new kind of rationality. Taking Hunter's definition to heart, I learned my lesson from my early encounters on college campuses. In a graduate course now on the history of political and economic theories, I suggested that faith and reason did not have to be held in juxtaposition, but that they needed to be understood in hierarchical relation to each other. Instead of being held as opposite poles, they needed to be held together, but in a certain pecking order, if you will. Rather than holding strictly to faith or reason as the basis of my understanding of the world, my reason is guided by faith. And my faith is based on an extraordinary but reasonable set of historical circumstances. For the first time, these postmodern students were asked to try to understand faith and reason as related components of wisdom. It took a while, but the conversation we had after that was stimulating and it was compelling, and it rocked a lot of their world. So with the basis for wisdom established, eloquence, Augustine proposed, is a human device by which truth penetrates the skeptical heart. It is true, for example, that human dignity ultimately depends on a society's treatment of every human being who inhabits that society. Now, we can syllogize and we can deduce, and we may convince our fellow citizens that this is in fact a true statement. But the question remains, can we persuade them to treat the unborn, the infirm, and the elderly with genuine dignity? What device is going to penetrate the skeptical heart so that society does turn to follow the greater good, a good which many will acknowledge intellectually, but which finds less and less support in our society's actions, the way people behave? So, what am I proposing regarding the trivium? First, I think the trivium needs to be understood as a means to successful education, not the end. We have not done our jobs as classically oriented Christian educators if we have run our students through their paces in grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. The whole of our teaching efforts should far exceed the sum of the parts of our pedagogy. Second, I believe that we need to see the elements of the trivium as unequal partners in this education. Grammar is essential to the basically educated person. Dialectic cannot be set aside if we expect our students to think habitually in an orderly fashion. But rhetoric, though it does comprise a certain set of skills, is far greater in significance than the other two elements, in that it best serves the ultimate purpose of Christian paideia, as the instrument through which Christians impact and build culture. Third, and this follows closely from the first two, our goal at every stage of instruction and learning the end that justifies the means employed through the trivium needs to be the classically defined orator who can see what is good and right through his acceptance of scriptural authority and the dialectic of moral philosophy, and who is capable of persuading and leading his fellow citizens toward that advantageous end. So, now that we've established the goal of classical education, guided by the trivium, let me briefly summarize the practice of rhetoric, because I'm convinced that few people who propose to educate classically have thought very carefully or had the opportunity to reflect very carefully on what actually comprises rhetoric. We need to summarize the practice of rhetoric so that we have a better understanding of the goal and how it should function in our students' experiences, in our homes, and in our schools. By the way, if you missed Jim Talman's workshops on rhetoric, you missed a good thing. And I don't know, Jim, can they pay you $100 and get your notes or something? Maybe you can tackle him in the parking lot and ask him for his notes on classical rhetoric. Okay. Fantastic notes that everybody here should have. If you're serious about classical schooling, if you're not serious about classical schooling, ignore them. But if you're serious about classical schooling, you need Jim Talman's notes on rhetoric. Now, first let me ask the question of what it is. What is it? We'll start with what it isn't. First, rhetoric is not merely important communication. That's sort of a modern understanding of rhetoric. But classically, rhetoric is not just important communication. And it's not just style. It's not just how you put words and phrases and ideas together. It is not a diversionary tactic in politics. Right? Rhetoric is ideally an integrative principle that runs throughout the classical curriculum. And this is what I mean when I talk about the elements of the trivium being unequal partners. We ought to be instructing our students in rhetoric beginning with their first day in school. They walk into the classroom in kindergarten if you do kindergarten, and in first grade if you do first grade, and the goal from that day one needs to be to produce the ideal orator, the good man speaking well. And so the rhetoric instruction begins on day one. Aristotle said that rhetoric is this. He says it's the faculty to discover all the available means of persuasion in any situation, whatever. Think about that for a second. All the available means of situation, all the available means of persuasion in any situation, whatever. Rhetoric is about everything. It has a place in any context where persuasion is going to be required, universally. The second question to ask, besides what it is what good is it? What good is it? Historically speaking, in Western culture, whenever Western civilization has found itself encountering a crisis of values or a crisis of vision, rhetoricians have somehow risen to the forefront, risen to the top of the educated classes. When societies find themselves in dire need of direction, rhetoric is critically essential because it requires someone who can see ahead and the application of objective moral and ethical principles of the greater good, and can collect people around him or her and lead them toward those goals. And I don't know about you, but I feel every day like our society is encountering a crisis of values and vision. The church doesn't know who it is there should be anymore. Families don't know how they should be structured anymore. The government's out of control in whatever respect you can consider out of control. There isn't a cultural institution in America today, and probably in the entire West today, which understands its place in society. We are indeed in a crisis of values and vision. And historically speaking, when that occurs, rhetoricians become critically necessary to the culture. Rhetoric also produces a critical mindset. It promotes the application of dialectics. Rhetoric is intelligence put to work. It's not enough to make people clever. We must put that clever to some good end. Rhetoric also enables us to distinguish between, or perhaps to discern between persuasion and coercion. Two ways to get people to do what we want them to do, right? But which is preferable? To force someone to do what we want to do, or to persuade them in their heart to know what is right and then to do it? Rhetoric enables us as a device to get to the heart of a matter, and perhaps even to the heart of a person, and persuade them to come along in a manner that attracts rather than repels people. I don't know about you, but sometimes I'm embarrassed by the lack of winsomeness that I find in evangelical and Orthodox churches. We need, as people of God, to develop a winsomeness and an attractiveness so that people will be more interested and willing to come along. And rhetoric propagates nobility. It calls on the higher aspirations of a culture. It points people toward the possibilities. And it is, in fact, possible for there to be a greater degree of justice on earth than we presently experience. There is, in fact, the possibility that we would experience a greater degree of virtue in our culture than we currently experience. And rhetoric calls the culture to those higher aspirations. There is a better way, and it is achievable way, even in this fallen world. What are the goals, then? The goals as teachers of rhetoric, as people who are training students to be this noble orator. First of all, rhetorical instruction produces sophisticated thinking. It engages students with the sort of thinking that is able to appreciate nuance. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and everything is black and everything is white, and it's so frustrating because you know that things aren't quite that black and that white. There are nuances to what we understand to be true and what we understand to be false, and the sophisticated thinker is able to hold to what is true, to reject what is false, but still to recognize the nuances. Sophisticated thinking also enables us to deal with paradox. Bob talked about this very eloquently yesterday. Paradox is at the heart of Christian faith, and if we're not producing people who are sophisticated enough in their thinking to understand that and to live with that, then we are producing stunted Christians. Rhetoric also produces the ability of critical analysis. It's not just dialectic. It's dialectic applied to the larger issues of culture and society. Rhetoric requires that we consider what is the greater good. There are all these options, all these things that we might do, but which of these is going to be most advantageous to us given our desire to be a noble people, a noble culture, a culture characterized by virtue. It also helps us to be able to discern between things that are harmful to us and things that are beneficial to us. Rhetoric provides a context and a format for measured communication so that when I have come to the conclusion of what is the best thing to do, then I have a format in which to house my argument and to draw people into that same way of thinking with me. One more thing. How should a rhetoric student's experience differ from a conventional school experience? This is a critical question. And if the answer to the question is, well, he takes rhetoric, we've got more thinking to do. How will the experience, the educational experience of your child, your students who are studying in a rhetorical context differ from the conventional experience of just about every other student in the country? 3 quick things. First of all, your student is going to encounter an insistence on breadth and diversity in their studies. Because an understanding of one's culture in a complete sense is essential to the orator's education. I'm constantly impressed by the contemporary feel that I get when I read Aristotle and Cicero and St. Augustine. Aristotle 2,500 years ago, Cicero 2,000 years ago, 2,100 years ago, Augustine 1,600 years ago. What were they talking about? Aristotle was talking about psychology, how people tick, the way Jim put it. What's Cicero talking about? He's talking about politics. He's talking about the way people get along together in a civilized society. What was Augustine talking about? He's talking about the interplay of religion in society and the effect that religious and theological thinking ought to have every day in the experience of people living in a society. We need to insist on the same breadth of study for our students, the liberal arts. Do not give up on the liberal arts. Don't let kids and parents asking you, how is he ever going to use this in life? It intimidates you. You must insist that every student in your school understands himself through the understanding of his culture in as broad a way as he and you can possibly manage. It said that the skilled rhetorician, this is a loose paraphrase, said that the skilled rhetorician needs to know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff. Otherwise, he's ineffective. Secondly, your rhetoric student's experience is going to differ from a conventional school experience because your school is going to be a natural incubator for genuine leadership. Genuine leadership. Eloquence. No matter what we say, eloquence is a chief component of leadership qualities in every society, in every period. If you cannot communicate, you will not have the opportunity to lead. How did George W. Bush become president? It wasn't his superior intelligence. What was it? How did Al Gore become the Democratic nominee for President of the United States? Whatever you think about Al Gore, and however wooden he is and how badly he dances the Macarena, the man knows how to debate. He knows how to debate. He knows how to make his point in a way that people hear, remember, and are willing to follow, even if he makes it up. But we can't get past it. Eloquence is a criterion for leadership, any society, and even in ours. And then thirdly, your student will experience in the rhetorically oriented school that he is in the context that is intent on developing his character. The good man speaking well. Theodore Roosevelt said, or at least he's quoted as saying, if you educate a man's mind and not his heart, you're left with an educated barbarian. We've got a lot of barbarians living among us today. So as we design the academic cultures of our schools, do we have the characteristics of the Christian orator firmly in mind? Are we preparing wise students who know God's Word and who can consistently apply its principles to contemporary society? Are they wise? And are we preparing eloquent students who God will use to lead their fellow citizens toward noble goals, service of Christ and of His kingdom? Are they eloquent, truly eloquent? Does the end of our vision of education really justify our means? Thank you very much.